Hello and welcome to this edition of the Hangout with EuroparlTV, live in the European Parliament with me, Paul Anderson. With me in the studio are the Polish MEP Jacek Saryusz-Wolski, a Vice Chair of the European People's Party, and German MEP Jo Leinen from the Socialists and Democrats. We're discussing the big political picture in the next 5 years, no less, as laid out by EU member states during their post-election summit last month. The issues are the economy, more integration, less austerity; energy, more independence, less CO2 emissions; and politics, reform of the EU institutions, more democracy. We'll be joined via video link by several specialists in these fields who I'll introduce as we go along. Suffice to say, our first guest is Darren Hughes from the Electoral Reform Society in the UK. And a very warm welcome to everybody. Before we start with the question of Europe's democratic credentials, let's run a few thoughts on that topic that surfaced during last week's inaugural plenary session.
Heute sind wir in einer Situation, dass an diesem Parlament, dieser einzigartigen Institution, keiner in der Europäischen Union, keiner auf der nationalen, keiner auf der europäischen Ebene mehr vorbei kann.
We were told that this time it would be different, that transparency would prevail over secrecy. But sadly, just a few weeks after the European elections, we are being invited to endorse a cosy consensus.
Per la prima volta nella storia si è fatta una campagna elettorale nella quale le grandi famiglie politiche europee hanno indicato le personalità.
If Mr Juncker's name is the only name put forward for the Parliament to vote on, as has always happened in past precedents, how can this possibly be a victory for democracy?
It is time to recognise that this Parliament is the real European democracy of the European continent.
Diese Macht dieser Idee hat sich durchgesetzt. Und wenn in allen Bereichen von Europa, in Europa die Rede von mehr Demokratie ist, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, dann ist der logische nächste Schritt, wer Demokratie fordert, dass dann die Entscheidungen, die für die Zukunft wichtig sind, in einem Parlament zu fällen sind.
Let me start off with you, Jo Leinen. What do you say to those criticisms that actually it was the complete opposite, that it was anything but democratic, much more a stitch-up between the grand parties of Europe?
Oh, we clearly have opened a new chapter of European democracy. In the past, those faces for Europe have only been known after the elections, so after the vote of the citizens. And this time, the major political families have presented personalities before the elections. So it was known that Martin Schulz is running for the Socialists, Juncker running for the European People's Party, and they have won the election. So that was the new method, the new promise, that those who win the elections, they get the candidate for the President of the Commission.
Let's as many MEPs have pointed out, this is the way it happens in member states across the whole of the EU. No big surprise there, but more of a big surprise that the rules over governing the appointment of chairs of the committees were ignored on this occasion, or the conventions were ignored, and some of the fringe parties who earned substantial support from the European electorate during the elections were squeezed out of chairmanships of key committees and co-chairmanships as well. How does that square with your idea that this was a democratic process?
The Hunt system is certainly one criteria of distributing positions in the Parliament, but as well honest behaviour. And those forces who turn their face against the Parliament when the European anthem is played, they have no right to have really prominent positions in this citizen chamber.
But they were voted for by a great many European citizens who
wanted
wanted
some
sort of change.
They don't necessarily need to lead committees or have really prominent positions. They are able to work, they get everything they need, but why should they represent the Parliament if they are against Europe?
Let's take your thoughts on this, Mr. Saryusz-Wolski.
First of all, the way we designate and will elect the President of the Commission is the copy of what happens in member states, and nobody questions the democratic nature and credentials of Prime Minister Cameron, for example. It's exactly the same way. Second, in terms of chairs and co-chairs of committees, they are elected. And during the vote, one political group did not get elected.
But the
and that's
reality is
democracy.
this was, maybe it is, but it's also a gigantic squeeze out of one particular group on the fringe,
Well,
the
it is a
FDD,
self-squeeze out
which is not
because,
democracy at all.
It's a self-squeeze out because those people say, coming to the parliament, we came here to blow it up. To liquidate EU. That's why they were not voted through. And this is very democratic.
OK, well, let me turn now to Darren Hughes in the UK, who's from the Electoral Reform Society. And I know, Darren, that you have been recently preoccupied with some of these issues on the EU's democratic credentials. I mean, perhaps you'd like to just say very briefly what you think and then turn to both MEPs and put one or two questions.
Sure. Well, we're convinced that there is a democratic deficit within the European Union, and that exists at two levels. One, citizens in the nation states of the individual members, but then also across Europe as well in the way that decisions are taken. But what we've got to try and do is come up with practical recommendations of how to improve that. So although we didn't think the candidate system for the presidency was perfect, we think it was better than what was there before, and anybody who was taking a genuine interest in the conduct of the election would have known that the party groupings had stated who their candidate was beforehand. One of the recommendations that we have made is that the size of the Commission has got just too big now that there are 28 members, and I just wonder whether they have a view of whether there could be a reduction in the number of commissioners, or maybe even a two-tier commission of more senior and then more junior posts that would be on rotation, so that the Commission would be more efficient and able to have more of a direct democratic flow.
Perhaps from the point of view of efficiency of the work of the Commission, it would be better not to have it so big. But the credibility or the way the Commission is perceived by the Member States, at that stage, I would say still it's justified to have every Member State's designate.
Mr. Juncker, if he gets elected, should reorganize the Commission. But I must say that some governments are speaking about reform of the EU, but when they had the chance to reform the Commission, they failed. In the Lisbon Treaty, it's clearly mentioned that we should have only 2/3 the number of commissioners as to the number of member states, and they decided different. They said no. Despite the treaty, every country can have the same commissioner like before.
But let's move on now to this question of the Grand Coalition before we wrap up very, very briefly. The survivability of this Grand Coalition. But there must surely come very soon big pressure points within this coalition. For example, over the question of the continuation of austerity policies. What for you are going to be the red lines that you won't cross of policies that are supported by the EPP?
Now, we have promised the citizens to come out of the economic stagnation. We want an investment program. We want more flexibility and a stability pact. We want a special program to fight youth unemployment. We want a fight against social and fiscal dumping. And that are the promises to our voters. And let's see whether we can agree or whether we then vote in dispute.
It's, Mr. Saryusz-Wolski, it's an article of faith, surely, isn't it, that there is no, beyond what is allowed within the Stability and Growth Pact, there is no additional flexibility, therefore you won't be able to accommodate the socialists on this question,
First, it is not Grand Coalition, because that brings about the pattern from Berlin. It is Grand Cooperation. We unite our forces to organize ourselves, to elect a President of the Commission, President of the Parliament, and then we cooperate. And the change is because the Parliament is less, as it used to be, centre-left, centre-right. It's pro-Europe and anti-Europe.
But what is it actually serving, this grand cooperation, as you say? Is its principal function just to squeeze out the fringes who have a bigger voice, whether they're in groups or non-aligned, now in the Parliament than before? Is that the simple
First of all,
function
it is not such a novelty. It did exist in the past. Additionally, now we are electing together the President of the Commission according the principles which we agreed before.
Okay.
That the winner takes the office.
Right, we're going to have to stop
But
it
it
there,
does
sorry.
not mean that we agree on everything.
Okay, we're going to have to move on now to our next topic, which is energy and Europe's need to reduce its dependence on Russia and Saudi Arabia, energy efficiency and the drive to reduce CO2 emissions. We're joined now by Maeve McClinn, Climate Change and Development Policy Officer at CAN Europe. And before we come to you, Maeve, let's hear again briefly from the plenary session on those questions.
We have to address energy concerns and we have to address the climate agenda. They need to be agreed together because it is simply not possible to have a sustainable economy with more jobs if you have an unsustainable environment.
Turning to energy policy, we should seek to reduce our overdependence on regimes who do not share our values, whether in the Middle East or Russia.
Fine words indeed that you've no doubt heard many times, Maeve McClinn, before. Before I go to the two MEPs, I'm going to open the floor first to you, Maeve. I mean, what's your brief thought on the next steps on climate change, given that we have a big conference later on this year on that question in New York and another even bigger one in Paris next year? And then perhaps you would put one or two questions to the MEPs.
Yeah, I mean, for us working on climate change, it's a massive kind of benchmark, I suppose, towards the end of this year and into next year. And I think given the precedent that's being set, we need to look forward and the role of the EU and the European Parliament within that. I think if we want to be more specific in discussing the issue of energy dependence and independence, we're looking at it very much from an energy savings perspective and what the European Parliament can do. And the last European Parliament, before it rounded up, they did a great work by setting looking forward in their own initiative report for a binding target of 40% energy savings. And it would be really interesting to know going forward how we can make this happen, and also in the broader framework of the overall climate and energy package that's been put forth by the European Commission.
Thank you very much indeed for
So
those questions.
for us, it's very much the questions to the MEPs is, you know, how do you see this process going forward?
Good. I want to put those questions directly from you to them. Let's start off with you first, Jo Leinen.
Yeah, the Parliament is quite good. We asked for 3 binding targets: energy efficiency, renewables and CO2 reduction. And I hope that the Council and the Commission come forward with legislative proposals that we will have in autumn 2014 and ready before the big UN conference in Paris next year. Europe has to have a unified position, and I think we must be leader in climate change because it serves our own interests. We are too dependent from energy imports, and all these new measures could help to be less dependent.
Jacek Saryusz-Wolski, you know about that dependence as a next-door neighbour to the former Soviet Union. What are your thoughts on, particularly on the question of CO2 reductions and reducing energy dependence on
A greener
Russia?
economy is a friend of less dependent EU.
Is Poland a green, economic-friendly country?
Within the limits of what's possible. And the limits are set by the endowment, how much coal, gas or whatever, wind or sun we have. And second, then the EU as such is now not only a country like Poland, but they are limited in terms of their sovereignty by the constant blackmail of a foreign power like Russia, using this in order to achieve its foreign policy goals towards us, but towards the emerging democracies like Ukraine. So we have to reduce this dependency for the security reason, to have cheaper, not only affordable but competitive energy, and we can do it by diversifying sources and routes, and also by progressing on the road towards greener economy. It is not either or, but there are various dependencies and constraints in different countries. You cannot expect that a country which has so much, which is so much coal-based, like Poland, I am saying that to Jo Leinen, to bring the same contribution in terms of CO2 emission as somebody who has 85% of energy from nuclear, like France, or countries who have so independent in terms of using wind energy, like Latvia.
Okay, good.
We are different, so there should be different solutions.
Let's before we just quickly move on, I'm going to come back to you, May, for literally 15 seconds, and I want to know what you think Europe, as a headline statement, should be bringing to the conference next year on CO2 reductions in Paris.
Europe should be making a much stronger, more ambitious greenhouse gas reductions target beyond what's on the table at the moment, and that would really show the leadership that it wants to represent.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's move on to our last, but by no means least topic, the economy. And we'll start with some thoughts here, also from the plenary session.
First, stronger economies with more jobs, making the most of the single market, reinforcing the economic and monetary union, promoting entrepreneurship, job creation and investment, and reinforcing our global attractiveness as a trading partner.
One thing is to end austerity. We simply cannot have a continent which has brought more and more poverty, especially among young people, and where young people do not see Europe as a promise anymore, but sometimes even as a threat. That needs to change.
La deuda es hoy un mecanismo de mando y saqueo a los pueblos del sur. Eso es lo que está sucediendo en países que con marcado racismo algunos denominan pigs. Pero supongo que son ustedes conscientes de que no hay Europa sin sus pueblos del sur, como no la hay sin sus pueblos del este, sometidos también a duras condiciones de la Troika, cuyo rumbo amenaza con destruir el proyecto europeo dejando un rastro de miseria, de pobreza y de violencia.
And we're joined now by Scholt Darvas, a senior fellow from the economic think tank in Brussels, Bruegel. He joins us on the web link. Before we come to you, Scholt, I'm going to go to each of our MEPs.
Yeah, the austerity measures in the last 5 years have been too strict and too unflexible. So let's make it less strict and less unflexible.
Okay, let me throw straight to with that thought, because it's neatly contained. What are your thoughts?
Flexibility, yes, but within the framework of the Stability Pact. Because without that there will be no growth, or there will be an illusion of growth. But within what is possible, it should be flexible as you claim.
And do you not buy, for example, the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Renzi's proposition that with it there will be no growth?
I don't buy. It's putting the carriage ahead of a horse.
And what do you say to that, Mr. Leinen?
I think that investments in education, in research, public investments in certain areas should be exempted from the austerity measures because they serve the purpose of involving economy and improving the life of the people. So it has to be more flexible.
Okay, let me turn to you now, Scholt Darvas. I'm sure you've heard many of those arguments aired, certainly over the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, what is your take on it?
I think in the periphery countries like Greece, but also Italy, there was simply no fiscal space and they had no choice but to consolidate. But I also think that a major demand stimulus would be needed, not in the periphery when there is no fiscal space. So I don't think that Italy has any room for maneuver. But for the rest of the EU or rest of the euro area, I think a major European investment program would be needed. My question, what can be done to have the unemployment and in particular the youth unemployment problem?
I think the whole of Europe is waiting for an answer on that question. Let's turn to you first of all, Mr. Saryusz-Wolski, on that question, well, youth unemployment.
In my perception, the answer is, the name is flexicurity. Easy to hire and easy to fire. The system, which is in Scandinavia, but mostly in Denmark, it necessitates certain societal and economic maturity. But when you are working, you should face the risk of losing the work because entrepreneurs demand it and the interest of the economy demands. But then you should be taken care of in terms of changing your qualifications, finding a new job.
We are not living in America or in China where hire and fire might be usual. That's not in Europe. But I think structural reforms are fine. We have done that in Germany. But they work only 3 to 5 years later. And we need both reforms and a fast-track program. And it's a shame that we have 6 billion euros, but nothing has been done on the field of youth guarantee and youth unemployment. So I think it must be immediately implemented.
Okay, one final thought, because we've got to wrap up now. From you, Jacek Saryusz-Wolski, I mean, no young person under 25 is ever going to say, yippee, we've got labour market reform coming down the hill towards us. We'll eventually find a job in 3 to 5 years. What concretely do you think then that should be created on an EU level to stimulate employment prospects for young people?
First, the best answer is education, as you say. Education prepares and then continues in the form of lifelong learning. And second is what I said, easy to hire. The young people have to be easily hireable or employable, if you wish, because of their qualifications, because of the system which encourages entrepreneurs and other institutions to take those young people into the job. But the 6 billion which you mentioned, it is just money to create best practices for member states to apply, because it's not sufficiently big money to solve the problem.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more on that issue in the coming months. That, unfortunately, is all we have time for, I'm afraid, right now. My thanks to my guests here, Joe Leinen and Jacek Saryusz-Wolski. On the line, Darren Hughes, Electoral Reform Society in the UK, Scholt Darvas from Bruegel, and Maeve McLean from CAN Europe. And many thanks to you for watching. Goodbye.